It's important to define our terms because as I'm going to talk about it, what I'd like to suggest to you is that I, as a black man in America, cannot be a racist. It's not possible. I can be prejudiced and I can be bigoted, but I can't be a racist. Because as I define racism, it is prejudice or bigotry plus social power plus legal authority. That is the way that you create a racist system. And without the second and third factor, prejudice can never turn into racism. And so what I would like to talk about is a concept that was most explicitly addressed by George Orwell in his book 1984. And he said two things that I think are really significant for us today. One is, who controls the past controls the future. And the second is, who controls the present controls the past. And what I would like to suggest to all of us is that our history has been stolen from us. It has been stolen deliberately and intentionally. And it has been done in a way that was brilliant. The South may have lost the Civil War, but they won the peace. And they won it with the most brilliant kinds of tactics that you have ever seen. And that part of our history has been completely stolen from us. I am 61 years old, and much of what I'm going to talk about now, I have learned in the past 3 or 4 years. And so there may be times when I ask, how many of you knew this? And I am not trying to suggest to anybody, look how ignorant you are. I know this stuff and you don't. That is not the purpose of my standing here and asking you to think about the stuff I'm going to talk about. What I'm asking you to do is to share my humiliation at being a black man in America, being born in Memphis, Tennessee, 11 years old when King gets assassinated, living the civil rights movement, not reading about it in a book. I went to Marquette University, to Harvard Law School, and I wasn't educated about this stuff. And when I started learning about it, I felt humiliated. I thought, how could I not know this? What excuse do I have for not knowing this? And part of it is that we're not taught it. Who controls the past controls the future, because if you control the narrative of what has come before, if you control the narrative of how we got to this moment in history, then you have heads up in terms of deciding where we go from there. Because the narrative of how we got here is critical. And who controls the present controls the past. We can laugh at the things that some people are saying about our past, but it makes a difference.
That's what America is about. A land of dreams and opportunity. There were other immigrants who came here in the bottom of slave ships, worked even longer, even harder for less. But they too had a dream that one day their sons, daughters, grandsons, granddaughters, great-grandsons, great-granddaughters might pursue prosperity and happiness in this land.
And I show you this clip because this is a black man in America saying these words. Bill O'Reilly at Fox News on one evening show said that, yeah, I know slaves built the White House, but they had good living conditions and they were given good food. The narrative about our history of white supremacy is being changed. And so when I see this, I chuckle and I think, what? Immigrants? Are we serious? And dreams of coming to this country? I mean, I understand there were nightmares, like who the hell are these people? I can't even understand what they're saying. I understand the whip and what that means, but there weren't any dreams of prosperity. There were nightmares of being stolen from your home and your family. And we can say this is ridiculous, but this is an official of the United States government telling people in this country, our children, your children, that this is our past. This is the accurate way to think about our past. Had Andrew Jackson been a little bit later, you wouldn't have had the Civil War. He was a very tough person, but he had a big heart. And he was really angry that he saw what was happening with regard to the Civil War. He said, there's no reason for this. Well, we know that Andrew Jackson died 16 years before the Civil War. So him saying, oh, we didn't have a reason for this? Andrew Jackson was a serial killer. Andrew Jackson owned slaves, and his family owned slaves his entire lifetime. He became rich from it, and he was brutal in the way he treated those slaves. Slaves meaning human beings. This is a book, American Slavery as It Is, from 1839. And all it is these two folks went to newspaper articles and they showed what slavery was. They just reprinted newspaper articles from the time. And this is a newspaper article about our Andrew Jackson, President of the United States. So if he was president, he's got to be a hero, because our past has to be the past of American exceptionalism and American freedom and equality. That's what all our presidents stood for. Well, Andrew Jackson had a runaway slave, and he put this ad in the newspaper saying, $50 reward, and I'll pay all the expenses, but I want you to see what he said at the end. And all refundable expenses paid, and $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him, to the amount of 300. That's who's on our $20 bill, Andrew Jackson. Our history has been stolen from us. And if we have any hope of moving from where we are right now to a different America in the future, we have got to take that history back. And so what happens if we actually go and look at what our true history is? 20 human beings were brought to Jonestown in 1619. That's where all of the stuff that Song talked about, all of the stuff that we are here to talk about today and tomorrow, started with 20 human beings. And when they were brought here, people said, holy shit. If we have human beings working for free, if we can own them as property, we can become wealthy. And I want to give you an example of how quickly this took off. And so we know this wasn't an issue of the good North and the evil South. The state of Massachusetts was where the first slave ship was built. And it only took about less than 20 years from 1619 for people to figure out, we can't be having 20 human beings coming at one time. We got to bring shiploads, because that's what's going to make our country rich. And I'd like you to look at some of the laws that were passed, because it tells you what America thought. It tells you kind of the core value, which I want to suggest to you, is that our country was founded on white supremacy. Can I see a show of hands? How many people in this room have ever owned a slave? No hands in the room. And I want to tell you, this is not our fault. It is not our responsibility. We didn't do this, but it is our shared history. And if we can't acknowledge it, we are in trouble. If you look at the nature of these laws, they are defining away the people's humanity, saying you are nothing but property. You may kill an enslaved person who resists authority. Think of the videos that you've seen over the past 5 years of traffic stops that have ended with unarmed black people getting killed. That rule seems to still be in effect. And look what you could get executed for: growing your own food, learning to read, or assembling in groups. Because if you start doing that, then difficult things can start to happen. Can I see a show of hands? How many people in the room know who the colonial Marines were? And so, folks, there are maybe 200 people in this room, and I think I see 2 hands. And I'm not telling you, I am telling you that you're ignorant about this. Ignorant meaning you don't know. But I am telling you, I was ignorant too. When I first heard this, I said, I got to watch my F-bombs because there are high school students in the room. And I want to apologize to you kids if I get a little worked up. But when I first heard about this, I thought, no, this couldn't be true. The colonial Marines were black slaves that fought with the British in the War of 1812. And you know why they fought with the British? Because the British said, hey, if we win, you get your freedom. And when people are fighting for their freedom, they can be vicious. About 3 or 4, I can't remember if it was weeks or months, before Francis Scott Key saw the bombs bursting in air in Baltimore, he and other Americans engaged the British with a group that included the colonial Marines. And there's a technical military term for what happened. They got a natural ass whooping. And they were driven back to Washington, D.C. The White House was set on fire. And Francis Scott Key, in his discussions with other people of the time, was saying things like this: what happens if they all take up arms against us? So how many people know the words to the 3rd verse of the national anthem? Can I see a show of hands? And there are a few more hands that are going up, and that is fantastic. But I hope that every person in this room who did not know this will have the same reaction that I did when I heard these words. Here is the 3rd verse to our national anthem, because Francis Scott Key remembered what those slaves did. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight and the gloom of the grave. And the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. That is our national anthem. If you have thoughts about Colin Kaepernick, what do you think now? And I'm going to come back to that. 40 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence owned other human beings. White supremacy was not something that anybody was concerned with. When the people wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and all of those words about freedom and justice and liberty were in those documents, they were not thinking about black and brown people. They had no problem saying that applies to us, but these other people over here, no, not at all. One of the reasons that Native Americans were driven off of their ancestral land is that we needed that land for the vast tobacco and cotton plantations. We had to have that land. And so Native Americans were just driven off of it. In 246 years of legal slavery, that's our history with slavery, 4 million Americans were enslaved at the close of the Civil War. That's 13% of the entire population in America. Can I just see a show of hands? We all knew slavery was there. How many of you knew it was this many people? And a few more hands go up. But that means that there are so many of us who are not aware, like I wasn't aware, of the extent of what was going on here. Take a look at those badges. Those were the badges of slave patrols. Modern day police departments had, in part, as their birth or as where they came from, these slave patrols. When I saw those badges, I had a physical reaction thinking, that can't be true. And let's talk about Andrew Jackson again, because he gave us the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Over 100,000 adults and children marched away from their ancestral lands. And you see how many of them died on the way. And you know why we had to do it? We had to do it because of this. Cotton was king in the South. And if the Civil War was about slavery and about money, then what kind of money are we talking about? Look at these figures. By 1840, cotton represented almost 60% of all United States exports. The production went from 1.5 million pounds in 1790 to 2.25 billion pounds by 1859. By 1860, the value of enslaved people in America was greater than the value of every bank, factory, and railroad combined. This is money. And what I am suggesting to you is, if you want to know why the Civil War happened, follow the money, because that will tell you the truth virtually any time. And what kind of money are we talking about? Because the role of slaves were more than just free labor in the economy. You had to have loans to buy the slaves, and if there was loans, there was going to be interest to repay the loan. There were insurance policies you could get, because sometimes your slaves would meet with an untimely death, and you'd certainly want to be compensated for that. The sales were taxed and notarized. And New York's portion, meaning the portion that was coming to the north, more than 40% of the revenue. This was not a Southern thing. This was an American institution. There were more millionaires per capita in 1860 in the Mississippi Valley, one of the poorest sections in America today. More millionaires per capita than anywhere else in America, and that was because of slavery. These are facts these are not anything that's in dispute. You can confirm this yourself. And so Texas officials, among others, are trying to teach children that slavery was a side issue in the Civil War. And one of the things that I would like to suggest is, when we are thinking about this, we have to go back and look at our history. And this is where, man, talk about having a physical reaction. These people forgot the story of King Cotton. How many people here are from the South? So I don't know if anybody here, have you ever had King Cotton bacon or King Cotton sausage? Okay, I see. I grew up in Tennessee. This was the lifebread of my family. You know, King Cotton was it was a food product, and it was on everything. And it was like in my childhood. Well, this is a picture from Memphis, Tennessee, and you can see the King Cotton logo over there. And there was even the Hotel King Cotton, which was like the fanciest hotel in Memphis. And then I found out what King Cotton meant, because it didn't mean this, which is what it meant to me as a kid. King Cotton was the theory that rich people in the South used to say, we can secede from the Union and it will work economically. Because if we cut off cotton exports, we can shut down the entire textile industry in New England. And England and France will have to fight with us, because we can shut down their textile industries. Remember, 60% of U.S. exports were cotton, and that was back in 1840. And it wasn't said any better than by this South Carolina senator who said this, without firing a gun, without drawing a sword: should they make war on us, we could bring the whole world to our feet. What would happen if no cotton was furnished for 3 years? England would topple headlong and carry the whole civilized world with her, save the South. No, you dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king. When I found out that the King Cotton bacon I had been eating was from this, it made me want to throw up. If you're wondering what the Civil War was about, how about not listening to anyone that's alive today? How about if we go back to the people who were actually fighting the war, saying why they were doing it? Because remember, at this time in America, there was no political correctness that would keep people from expressing their belief in white supremacy. White supremacy is what our country was founded on. And that's not our fault, it's just our shared history. And so if we go back to see what these people were saying about why they fought the Civil War, they're saying it as clearly as they possibly can. The great truth is, the Negro is not equal to the white man. Can he say it any clearer? How many people knew that in 1861, the mayor of New York City was advocating that New York City leave the Union? Can I see a show? I see maybe 3 or 4 hands. The mayor of New York City wrote a tome about why New York City should withdraw from the Union. Not to support the South, but hey, we want to be friends with everybody. We'll deal with the North and we'll deal with the South, because the money coming in is so much, we can't afford to lose that money. This is a quote, and maybe we recognize who said this. You and we are different races. We have between us a broader difference than exists between almost any other two races. Whether it's right or wrong, I need not discuss, but this physical difference is a great disadvantage to us both. And I think your race suffers very greatly, many of them by living among us, while ours suffers from your presence. We each suffer on both sides. That's Abraham Lincoln. I was taught that Abraham Lincoln was my savior. I was taught that Abraham Lincoln fought against slavery because he knew there was a moral imperative to get rid of it. When you go back and read what Abraham Lincoln said, what he said was, if I can keep the Union together and get rid of slavery, I will. If I can keep the Union together and keep slavery, I will. I want to keep the Union together. He did what he did, and that was fantastic. But we lionize him as this hero of racial equality when that is the lie about our history. And just to let you know, any debate about reparations for slavery, it's a false debate. Because when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he also paid $1 million. This is in 1862 money, $1 million to Washington, D.C. slave owners for loss of property. Even in the middle of the Civil War, we're still getting rid of the natives because we need that land. 50 million acres of land being given away starting in 1862. And then 100 million acres of land given to railroad companies. When you start thinking about affirmative action, and what people think about affirmative action in America today, I am asking you to remember that affirmative action goes all the way back to 1830, the Indian Removal Act. And it goes through our history. It was just affirmative action for white people because white supremacy was what we were basing our culture on. And I just think that while we're at this point, it's just interesting to get a perspective about it. So, that's a CNN poll from June of 2016. That's how many people think that the Confederate flag is an issue or a symbol of Southern pride. Whenever I have this discussion, I always want to say to the people, if you say it's about heritage or you say it's about culture, those are adjectives. Tell me what that culture is. Tell me what that history is. Because when we start talking about it specifically, you can't get away from the role of slavery. But I have an idea. How about if we ask, nobody alive today, the states that withdrew from the Union, what did they have to say about why they did it? Because that might be instructive. Well, South Carolina, the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. That's why we're leaving. Mississippi said, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. They are telling you as clearly as they can what they think about the concept of white supremacy. Louisiana, the people of the slaveholding states are bound together by the same necessity and determination to preserve African slavery. Necessity. The way they are making the money is by owning slaves. Alabama declared that Lincoln cannot be regarded otherwise than the election of Lincoln is a solemn declaration on the part of the great majority of Northern people of hostility to the South, and this last phrase is critical, her property and her institutions. How much clearer can they tell you what this war was about? And yet we have people who are teaching our children that this had little to do with the war. Why is that? This is my favorite, I will admit, from Texas. All white men are, and of right ought to be, entitled to equal civil and political rights, that the servitude of the African race as existing in the states is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator. Do you think that losing a war is going to make people change a belief that's stated like that? Slavery is the element of all value, and the destruction of that destroys all that is property. They are saying it as clearly as they can. And then, if you have any further doubts about what the flag means, how about if you go and ask, I don't know, the guy who made it? We are fighting to maintain the heaven-ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. Folks, that is what the Civil War was about. That is what the Confederate flag is about. White supremacy. It was about it then, and it was about that same thing several weeks ago in Charlottesville, Virginia. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the man who originated the KKK after the Civil War. As you can see, this bust, which says Confederate States Army, this bust is in the State House in Tennessee. And what William Bedford Forrest said about the Civil War, if we ain't fighting to keep slavery, then what the hell are we fighting for? Because William Bedford Forrest didn't have a problem acknowledging the truth about what the Civil War was about. You can say you're somebody new. You can give yourself a whole new story. But what came first is who you really are. And what happened before is what really happened. That's D'Angelo Barksdale from The Wire. And it is the truth. And it is the truth about our history. We have got to reclaim our history. 40 acres and a mule, that was a promise to every black family or freed slave family, although I don't know exactly how they were going to figure that out since the families were broken up and sent, to hither and there and wherever. But that promise wasn't fulfilled. Economists today say that had that happened, it would have infused into the African American community in America about $3 trillion over time. And this is a comment about that very thing.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Now, this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
This is not the Martin Luther King that they pull out on Martin Luther King Day or in Black History Month. There were 700,000 registered black voters after the Civil War. What people forget is that Reconstruction was actually working. Over 2,000 black men were elected to political office in the South. We got a room full of lawyers. How many people are familiar with the 1875 Civil Rights Act? There is less than a tenth of the hands that go up. And I don't blame you. We don't get taught this in school. The 1875 Civil Rights Act outlawed discrimination in housing, in public education, in all kinds of places. It was just ruled unconstitutional several years later because it interfered with private choice, I think was the way the court said it. Well, Reconstruction ended with the election of Rutherford Hayes because part of the deal that he made to get reelected was that the troops would be withdrawn from the South. And when the troops started to withdraw, the Confederacy regrouped as organizations like the KKK. And if you want any example of how this went off the cliff quickly, passing laws to vagrancy laws and other kinds of laws that would essentially let them re-enslave blacks. In Louisiana, there were 130,000 registered black voters in 1896, and that went to 5,000 in 1898. Why do you think 125,000 people decided not to vote? $100 to start a business if you were a black person. We're talking 1870. $100 is a fortune. And what we're talking about here is the concept of the American dream. Your family gets better, and we are here today in part because our ancestors worked hard. And so your great-grandparents worked hard so your grandparents wouldn't have it so hard. And your grandparents worked hard so your parents wouldn't have it so hard. And your parents worked hard so you would have it better. And now you're busting your ass so your kids will have it better. And that's like the American dream. And what I am suggesting is that the truth about our history shows that there were deliberate, intentional, and incredibly effective roadblocks to black and brown people advancing in America. It wasn't done by mistake. We're not talking about implicit bias anymore. We are talking about deliberate, intentional behavior. People think that slavery as it was practiced during the Civil War ended in 1865. That is a confirmable falsehood. Because vagrancy laws and other kinds of laws, what they allowed people in the South to do was to arrest mostly black men, and then the municipality that arrested them would rent them out. And the black men would go back to the plantations, sometimes the very same plantations where they were slaves. And they would do the exact same work they did as slaves, and they still wouldn't get paid for it. Now, there was payment, but the payment went to the municipalities, not to the men doing the work. And this practice continued unabated until 1941. Many people will say it continued after that. This is one of the most important times in American history. That is what at least I have come to believe, because the Civil War is now over. We're about 30 years out from the Civil War, and Reconstruction started, and there was this advancement that was going on in the black community. And now people aren't slaves, and they're moving throughout America. And what I believe white America said to itself is, pardon my French, we got to remind these niggers what their place is. And I use that language for a reason, because what I'm about to share with you, what I discovered about this period of time, is remarkable. We first start with Plessy versus Ferguson, where the culture of white supremacy was essentially adopted by our Supreme Court. Separate but equal. There is no other way to define separate but equal, right? But an endorsement of white supremacy. I am not good enough to be in the same room with you, or to drink from the same water fountain as you, or to use the same toilet as you. And Donald Trump, with his tweets about Confederate monuments, sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You can't change history. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, what's next? Washington, Jefferson? So foolish, the beauty that is being taken out of our cities, the beauty. So George Washington has a monument in Washington, D.C., and George Washington owned slaves, absolutely. That monument is there not because he owned slaves. That monument is there not because he was a traitor to his country and led an army against his country. That monument is there because he did something like, I don't know, found the country. That was apparently a pretty big deal. Anyone can distinguish the difference between monuments to people who may have owned slaves, but whose actions are what the monuments are about. The Confederate monuments are different, and this is something I have looked at really carefully. The Confederate monuments are monuments to slavery and white supremacy, because that's what these Confederate folks did. And that's why the monuments were built. Many people think, well, these monuments, it's like they didn't just pop up out of nowhere, and they weren't built at the end of the Civil War. So let's talk about what's happening at the turn of the century. That's more than an average of one person a week. The Southern Poverty Law Center has done an extensive review of Confederate monuments in this country. I recommend that you get this publication because it is really extensive and it tells you something about the history of these monuments and how they are monuments to white supremacy. So where are they? Well, that's the western half of the country. Those are the top 10 states with numbers of monuments. There's 1,503 that the Southern Poverty Law Center found, and they don't know that that's all of them. 109 public schools named for Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, 80 counties and cities, 9 official Confederate holidays in 6 states, and 10 United States military bases. And let's remember that what the Confederate soldiers did was to use every bit of courage, bravery, and strength that they had to kill American soldiers. Since when do we have monuments to people who kill American soldiers? That gives you an example that all of these monuments virtually are in the states that made up the Confederacy. And when were they built? That's why I'm saying that this period between 1895 and about 1921, this was when we were making America great again, by making sure that the people who were black and brown in this country remembered their place. This movie came out in 1915. Up until several years ago, there were still people in Hollywood who would tell you that this was one of the greatest movies ever produced. And if you look at it, it says, employing the services of 18,000 people, accompanied by a 40-person orchestra. This was released in February of 1915. It took 3 years to produce it. This was the first movie ever shown in the White House. Woodrow Wilson screened it in the White House. And they didn't have black actors, they had white actors in blackface. And this is what Woodrow Wilson said, the President of the United States, after this movie was screened. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South, to protect the Southern country. When you have the President of the United States making statements like this about white supremacy, I'd ask you to think not about 1915, but about 2017 and what that can imply, what that can mean. And on the night before Thanksgiving in 1915, A man named William Simmons went to Stone Mountain, Georgia, and this is what he brought with him. He brought bricks to build an altar. He brought an American flag, a Holy Bible, and an unsheathed sword. And he set a cross on fire, and he declared the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Stone Mountain, Georgia. The largest bas relief in the world. And it is dedicated to one thing: the celebration of white supremacy. If you have never seen it, I encourage you to take a drive by it. When I was a kid, my parents took us on a vacation to something called Six Flags over Georgia. It was like a big amusement park. And we had to drive past Stone Mountain. And I remember looking at it and going, oh my God, that's so big, look at that. And I couldn't understand why my parents were so quiet and seemingly so angry. Because to me, it was just a big picture of some guys on horses. And of course, it means something much, much more than that. It was conceived in 1912 by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The north face of the mountain was deeded to the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1916. And they began work in 1922 with the KKK, but then it was abandoned for 36 years. And then the state of Georgia bought the property. And the state of Georgia, using Georgia tax dollars, created that monument. Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and the third guy is leaving my mind, Stonewall Jackson. It was completed in 1972. When people talk about the greatest mass shootings in U.S. history, these are often forgotten. All three incidents right in this time period where essentially black homes were targeted, they were attacked, they were set on fire, and whites would stand outside with rifles and just shoot people as they came out. This is a newspaper ad about the East St. Louis riot. Dead in East St. Louis may reach 250. And I have put up this article time and time again, and it just goes like when Song talked about the attention test or what you pay attention to. I had never seen, this is 1917, right here, the little article. The first bale of new cotton crop was sold at auction for $1,500 on the floor of the New York Cotton Exchange yesterday. The New York Cotton Exchange. Cotton was still king in the South because we had that still same supply of almost free labor. We were just doing it with the criminal justice system instead of with outright slavery. This is another article from the same event, and I just always think this one is interesting. The Negroes did not start the trouble. In September 30th, in 1919, in Arkansas, there was a shootout. A bunch of blacks were gathered in a church. They were sharecroppers, and they were talking about trying to unionize. And you know that think back to those slave laws, you could be executed or punished if you gathered in groups. So the law in Arkansas said, we got a bunch of colored people in a church. That's not a good thing. They showed up. Everybody had guns. 2 law enforcement officers got killed. Well, this is an article that was in the newspaper in Arkansas after the shootout happened. Soldiers now here to preserve order will return to Little Rock within a short time. No innocent Negro has been arrested. All you have to do is remain at work just as if nothing had happened. Phillips County has always been peaceful, law-abiding. Stop talking, stay at home, go to work, don't worry. Well, the shootout was September 30th. By October 31st, they had arrested 122 blacks and charged them with crimes up and down the criminal code. By November 5th, the first 12 people had been tried, convicted, and given the death penalty. And so you know what happened with the rest of them. People started pleading guilty, and some people got released, and that was the end of that. The white newspapers who talk about this incident will tell you that there were maybe 250 people killed. The black newspapers from the same time will say it was closer to 800. because they just kicked bodies into the Mississippi River, and those bodies were never counted. Tulsa, Oklahoma was the home of one of the most thriving black communities in America, and in 1921, the whites in Tulsa decided they had had enough, so they simply burned it to the ground. This was one of the first incidents of air warfare in the United States. There were propeller planes that flew over, dropping burning tar onto black homes. That's how systematic it was. Pardon me. And the woman here just said terrorism, and you are right. That's terrorism. I show you this because it's a difficult image, and especially for the high school kids, but I want you to just to look at these faces to understand the depth of white supremacy in America, because the event that they were attending was horrific. And what I want you to understand is that between 1868 and 1966, there were about 5,000 documented lynchings. We ain't talking about the undocumented ones. Documented lynchings. And that is an average of one lynching a week for a century. That is terrorism. And that can only happen in a country where white supremacy is a foundation that is significant. There's no other way this could happen. Do people know that African Americans and Latinos were excluded from Social Security? They didn't write the law and said no black and brown people can get Social Security. They just said no agricultural workers or domestic workers. Who do you think that was? This was part of the political discourse of America by a United States senator. What I'm trying to suggest is we want to think that these were like little isolated pockets or it wasn't that bad. This was a disease, and it was spread throughout this country in an incredibly explicit way. And just in case people forget, when did the Confederate flag come back? It came back in 1948 when Strom Thurmond created the Dixiecrat Party. And as they said, as clearly as they could, we stand for the segregation of the races. They are saying it as clearly as they can, and I'm just asking, why can't we believe them and acknowledge that this is what America was about? From 1934 to 1968, it was the law that you don't sell homes to black people in white neighborhoods because that will drive down the property values. Redlining wasn't just the culture that created segregation in America, it was the law. It was required. Can somebody tell me how much time I have? Okay. And so when you are thinking about thoughts that all of us have had at one time or another with clients of color, other people succeed, why haven't you? Why is your family still in this circumstance? Why haven't you done better after all this time? Part of what I'd like you to understand is that there were intentional, deliberate roadblocks that have an effect up until today. Blacks were left out of the GI Bill in 1944. So all of those heroes who came back from fighting the white supremacist on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, those heroes who came back, and what we said is, you fought for our country. You were willing to give your life, and we are going to help you get back into our community. We're going to give you the GI Bill. We're going to help you buy a home, unless you're black. I want to suggest this book to you. It's written by a historian, Molly Michaelmore. It's called Tax and Spend, the Welfare State, Tax Politics, and the Limits of American Liberalism. And I won't read this whole quote, but what she is essentially saying is that white America was given all kinds of benefits through regressive taxes and things like Social Security, Medicare, all kinds of government programs. And still and yet, you hear so many people today who are like, I did this on my own. I didn't have any government help. And that's just not the truth. It's just not the truth. And here's the issue with that. What's wrong with the government helping the people that it governs? Isn't that supposed to be what government is for? So affirmative action has never been a problem for America, as long as the people receiving it were white. And then we have Brown versus the board. And this was probably one of the most important things that impacted my lifetime. I want to remind you of the argument that Thurgood Marshall made during Brown versus the board. Separate but equal is rooted in the deep desire to keep people who were formerly slaves as near to that state as is possible. And many of us remember these images of what it took, military, to get 5 and 6 and 7-year-old black kids to be able to walk into a school. And so I'd like you to just stop for a minute and understand. It took 89 years after the Civil War for white America to look at a person like me and say, I guess it's okay if you sit in the same classroom with my children. And that wasn't just the culture of the United States, that was the law of the land. And of course, schools today are more segregated than they were in 1954. This is a measure. Low poverty schools are schools that have 0 to 25% of their students eligible for free lunch. Mid-low poverty schools, it's between 25 and 50% eligible for free lunch. Mid-high poverty schools, between 50 and 75%. And high poverty schools, 75% or more eligible for free lunch. That's America today. And this is why, believe me, I get it. I get it. And it's like, Elvis Costello said, I used to be disgusted, now I try and be amused. And I can't be, I do laugh, but it's like the thing I just want to remind us of is that this is like some crazy shit. I apologize to the high school students, but give me some room here. This is crazy, but this is the leader of the Department of Education. This is a person in the United States government giving this narrative. Historic black universities and colleges were pioneers of school choice. They are living proof that when more options are provided to students, they are afforded greater access and greater quality. Those schools were created because white America wouldn't let us into their schools. And of course, President Trump is now saying he's got to look at the funding for these schools because funding them might be racist. There's the second period of an explosion in the monuments. That's the period called the Civil Rights Movement. And so many people say that this is the image that sparked the Civil Rights Movement. And so this image is disturbing, but this is what many Americans woke up to on a Sunday morning because Emmett Till's mother said, I am keeping this casket open. And I honestly believe that a huge number of white Americans in 1955 looked at that picture and said something like this to themselves, I know those colored people are a problem, but I didn't sign up for this. And the Civil Rights Movement was born. I show you this picture because this guy graduated with his doctorate in June of 1955. And by December of that year, the Montgomery bus boycott was starting. Everybody says, oh, Martin Luther King was the hero of the Montgomery bus boycott. And what you understand when you read the history is that the Montgomery Improvement Association was the organization that pulled this together. And the older black ministers in Montgomery basically said, somebody's going to jail behind this, so let's give it to the new guy. Martin Luther King was not the hero of this boycott. Those were the heroes of this boycott. And it's not just Rosa Parks. These are the women that had normal work days of maybe 7, 8 in the morning until 5, 6 in the evening because they were riding the bus into the white neighborhoods where they were maids in the white homes and then riding the bus back to their neighborhoods. During the boycott, which lasted for more than a year, they're getting up at 4 and 5 in the morning because they got to walk to the white neighborhoods. And they're not getting back until 9 or 10 at night. And then they're trying to take care of their families. And then they're getting up the next day and doing it all over again for 373 days. And if my commute to work is 15 minutes late, I get pissed off. Those were the heroes of that bus boycott. And when Song Richardson said, start with yes, one of the challenges that I am giving myself and that I offer to you is these women brought down segregation in public travel in America. And they had no idea they were going to do it. None of them had a high school education. None of them were lawyers. So what do we say to them when we say, oh, this is really hard. I don't know if I'm willing to go that far. I don't know if I'm willing to try something new. Try saying it to them, and then ask yourself how far you're willing to go. I shared this document with you. You won't be able to read it. I'll just point it out to you. This is the document that was sent around Montgomery, Alabama, the night on Sunday evening, the night before the buses were going to be integrated the next day. And I want you to understand how black folks in America have always understood that there is a huge difference between the law and living. The bus driver is in charge of the bus and has been instructed to obey the law. Assume he will cooperate in helping you occupy any vacant seat. Do not deliberately sit by a white person unless there is no other seat. Yeah, I know the law says you can sit anywhere you want, but this is Montgomery, Alabama, and I got to live and get home tonight. In case of an incident, talk as little as possible, always in a quiet tone. Don't get up from your seat. If another person is being molested, do not arise to go to his defense, but pray for the oppressor and use moral and spiritual force to carry on the struggle for justice. Translate it, if somebody's getting an ass whooping, sit there and watch it. Because if you get up to help, we all know what's going to happen. And finally, the one that breaks my heart, if you feel you cannot take it, just walk for another week or two. So this was the celebration document from winning the Montgomery bus boycott. And when we talk about Song's comments to us about personal objectivity or viewing ourselves as righteous and religious and moral people, I just ask you to consider this quote from the good people of Levittown, Pennsylvania in 1957. This is America. And so in 1963, Medgar Evers gets shot. And in September of that year, these 4 girls get killed in this church. This is the young girl that survived. And if you want to see, the woman in the front row mentioned terrorism. If you want to see the faces of people who have dealt with terrorism, look at these faces, because they're watching the bodies being pulled out of the church. Those are the faces of people who know exactly what terrorism is. That's my hometown in 1968 when King got shot. And I want to point out these 2 things to you. This is one of the things he said in 1955. We want to love our enemies, be good to them. This is what we must live by. We must meet hate with love. We must love our white brothers no matter what they do to us. About 3 months or 4 months before he was killed at the end of 1967, he said this: Urban riots are a special form of violence. They are not insurrections. The rioters are not seeking to seize territory or gain control of institutions. They are mainly intended to shock the white community, but most of all, alienate it from society, and knowing society cherishes property above people, they are, the rioters, shocking society by abusing property rights. Has anybody ever heard that quote from Martin Luther King before? Couple people? They don't pull out that quote when they're talking about Martin Luther King, because Martin Luther King is safe. Martin Luther King says, even if they are killing you, just pray for them and hope it will get better. Martin Luther King, or at least the whited out version of Martin Luther King, is comfortable for America. The real Dr. King was not. Let's remember, this guy got arrested 30 times in 13 years. What we would call that person today is a thug. And that's what they were calling him back in the 60s. So let's remember, the fact that we deify him now and he's got a monument on the wall, that's all good and nice. But the exact same things we are saying about Black Lives Matter activists, white America was saying about Martin Luther King in the 1960s. Please remember that as you think about what's happening today. Oh, and I just have to do that. This is what they found in his briefcase in the Lorraine Motel. April 4th, 1968. He was scheduled to give a speech that Sunday, and that was the title of the speech that he was about to give. I wonder if he had lived another week, if that speech would have made an impact on the way we see him today. What did that stuff about housing, how did that impact America? By 1984, almost all the GI mortgages are paid off. And the median white household net worth, $39,000. The median black household net worth, $3,000. And all of the economists say the difference in that is home ownership. And that home ownership was denied to black people on purpose. So on your right, there's the guy who has a little gangster lean and a hat, and that's me. This was taken in the early 60s, I'm not sure when, but it's me, my father, and my two brothers, and one of my sisters. My other sister hadn't been born yet. And I want to talk to you for just a second about what luck looks like. Song told you that Bob Berukowitz hired many of us who are on this program, and Bob gave me my first legal job. We'll never, ever forget that. I'm not supposed to be standing here. I was absolutely, positively not the smartest person, not even in my family, but certainly not in my neighborhood. I got lucky, because that's the house that I grew up in a segregated neighborhood in Memphis. And one of the things I'd ask you to look at is, look at those hedges. They're perfect. That's why my father had 3 sons, because he would sit in a lawn chair and read a paper while we're clipping the hedges. And I have like PTSD, because he would sit there and he'd go, sorry for that. The house had 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a kitchen, kind of a den, and we had mom, dad, and 4 kids. That's the house we moved to. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, in a very quiet neighborhood, each kid having a quiet place to study, in a safe neighborhood. All the kind of things that we say make the foundation for success in a family. That house that we used to live in the segregated neighborhood, the neighborhood was being knocked down to put up a shopping mall. If you go to Memphis, Tennessee today and go to 5038 William Arnold Road, you will see a big shopping center. That used to be our house. And my dad wouldn't sell the house. He made a deal with the developer. I'm going to go find the house, and you pay for that house, and I'll give you my house. Developer says, fine. My dad and my mother were devout Catholics. And the white Catholic schools in Memphis were in East Memphis, and that's where they decided they were going to live. So they went and looked for houses, and contracts would get lost. Some other agent had sold it. One agent called and said, I had your contract, and I went fishing, and it fell out of the boat. I was looking for the dog, but it was like the fish ate it. And so finally, my dad had people, white friends of ours, help us. We went, offered the asking price for the house. This white family went and offered less, and they sold it to them. But they were buying it for us. My dad got the asking price from the developer, bought the house, used the other money to help put his children through school. So what I'm telling you is that you are looking here at luck. This is what luck looks like. I have worked as hard as anybody else in this room for what I've done in my career, but hard work and luck are not mutually exclusive. And so what I am pleading with you is, don't you dare look at me or Song Richardson or any other person of color who gets up on this stage today and tomorrow and say, it must not be that bad. Look, they've made it. I've made it because I was lucky. And that doesn't diminish my hard work or my intellect. It's just the truth. We'll go after the racist. The subliminal appeal to the anti-black voter was always present in Nixon's statements and speeches. This is a quote from John Ehrlichman. You want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in '68 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin and criminalizing them both, we could disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. That's what the prison population looked like as Nixon came into office. This was not done by accident. This was not done by mistake. This was done deliberately. And the consequences of that are severe. As long as we keep pretending that it was an accident, I think we're in trouble.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all don't quote me.
You said y'all don't quote me.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
Ronald Reagan, the great communicator. When Ronald Reagan was nominated as president, he made his first speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And he talked to that crowd about states' rights. And I guarantee you, the people in Philadelphia, Mississippi knew exactly what he was talking about. These are studies that have been repeated 3, 4, 5 times in the last 30 years. They dummy up resumes. They have some resumes with a black-sounding name, some resumes with a white-sounding name, and the result is the white-sounding resumes get all of the callbacks, or mostly all of the callbacks, and the resumes are identical in terms of facts and qualifications and this kind of thing. So one of the times when you're thinking about why don't you have a job, I've thought this about clients of color. Why aren't you working harder? You've been unemployed for a long time. Maybe you need to take one step back or a half step back and think there are a whole lot of forces going on here that are not being recognized. And it's easy for us if we can say it's all about you. And I am not saying that personal responsibility plays no role in America. It does. But it is so easy when we say this is all about personal responsibility, because it takes the weight off our shoulders for our collective history and our collective refusal to acknowledge that history. I'm going to skip some stuff because I want to end here. Our time is almost up. I do leave you with this. Economically, 0.5% of the national wealth owned by black Americans just after emancipation in 1865. That makes perfect sense. In 1990, it's 1%. Do you think that's because we're stupid, or we're lazy, or we're not capable of being economically successful? Now, some people say, hey, it doubled. And I guess it did. So I just take you through kind of a strolling of what we have all seen. And just so this is not a political thing, this ain't just about Donald Trump and the Republican Party. The Democrats and Bill Clinton did more damage with this 1994 crime bill. And let's remember Hillary Clinton talking about super predators who needed to be brought to heel. Now today, when the white kids are getting addicted to opioids, we are going crazy. Oh my God, it's drug addiction. We have to help these children. We can't make them criminals. These are our children. We have to help them. And I'm not saying that's the wrong thing. It is the right thing. But how come we couldn't see that same devastation in the 90s when it was kids that looked like me with crack cocaine? And look at what Hillary says. We can talk about how they got that way, but first we bring them to heel. Each of these black politicians and quote-unquote leaders supported mandatory minimum drug sentences and other things that have contributed to mass incarceration. Do you think that all black people think the same? Do you think that black people can't make mistakes? I've actually heard people say, well, the fact that these people supported some of these laws shows that the laws weren't racist. No, it just shows that they were wrong. That's the impact of the Fair Housing Act and redlining over the years. It is still having an impact today.
My father's conversation with me was daily.
My grandfather talked to me as a black man from Augusta, Georgia, growing up in the Deep South.
It's probably Rob, my older brother, had this conversation. But then it's more of like, you know, wear a condom, do this. You know, it's like little man lessons.
When a cop pulls you over.
When you get pulled over, not if you get pulled over.
At some point, you will get pulled over, and here is how you act.
As a young black man growing up in New York, I've had, a few run-ins with the police and being completely innocent.
The people pull us out of the car, throw us on the floor. It's in February, so it's like snow and slush and stuff on the ground. Put their knees in our back, put the guns to our head.
As I'm putting my hands on the steering wheel so I don't make the police nervous, I realized how nervous I was. And then I realized my children were nervous.
The thing that people say is you have to talk to him before he experiences racism himself. But when is that?
He is going to turn into a large, scary black man. And it's that's not who he is, but that's how he will be perceived. I know what this kid's going to look. He's going to look like him. You know, I know what he's going to look like.
I'm a large, scary black man.
You are a large, scary black man. Okay?
That's a problem in and of itself.
And that's a problem.
I am not large nor scary.
I can't do anything with that.
I'm short. Anyway, go ahead.
It's frightening. And I'm being very light when I use the word frightening.
If something goes wrong, your first line of defense, your parents not being there, is to go to the police.
If you're Caucasian.
So, I mean,
yes,
still,
that's what you teach your children. Unfortunately, it can't work for black children, right?
It doesn't mean that every police officer is inherently a bad person. But what it does mean is that the police force, that institution, does not look out for your best interests.
There's this unspoken code of racism and white supremacy that says that my life does not matter.
You can put your hands up and say and cooperate and say that I'm choking and still be killed, and then there's no repercussions.
It's maddening. I get so frustrated and angry about having to prepare my kids for something that they're not responsible for.
And these are conversations that people of other races do not have to have with their children.
The conversation with him was really just, look, you're a beautiful young boy.
Being an African American is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful blessing. You have come from great people, but it's also a hard thing.
In America, because of your skin color, as a black boy and as a black man, we are going to be dealing with a lot of danger.
Under no circumstance are you to talk to the police if you're arrested until I get there.
Do what they say. Don't get into any arguments.
Make sure your hands are out of your pockets so they can see.
These are the questions you can ask. This is who to call. This is what happens if this bad thing. It's not like, please, master, don't whip me. No, it's like, excuse me, sir, what is your badge number? I'm going to film this.
If you want police brutality to stop, if you want police to treat you like a human being, then you have to see yourself as a human being.
You have every right in this world that anyone else does.
What I love about you as my son is I remember when we thought about having you and, knowing that we wanted you and watching you grow.
You are the Muhammad Ali, you are the Malcolm X, you are the Martin Luther King.
You are an amazing young man, and the future is yours.
And I will do my best to make sure you're safe. That's it.
I've never felt worse that our ability to see humanity seems to stop at racial lines. I've never felt like we have a harder time seeing the basic humanity in each other. And what this election made really clear to me is that you can talk about reparations just so long as you're talking about white people. So we've had an entire election that is about how there's been a forgotten middle and lower class group, in particular white manufacturing men in the Rust Belt who've been left behind by big structural changes, in particular globalization, their jobs leaving. And the entire conversation has been, we cannot leave these fellow citizens behind.
My base and the people that like me best, frankly, are poor people and working people, working class people, and I'm very proud of that. I think the people that like me the least are the rich people.
We're not going to leave people who are part of our community behind. And not everybody's meant to be a lawyer or a doctor or a physicist. We're going to find ways to build schools, retrain people, build a new economy that's inclusive. That is a conversation that was the driving heartbeat of this election. If you ask the same questions about African Americans who have a much clearer history of being disenfranchised, disabled, cut out of the social deal, cut out of post-World War II economic building, the GI Bill, redlined out of neighborhoods, loan to predatory loans, all of the things that are just, these are not controversial, complicated. We have very clearly done wrong by many minority communities. But if you bring that up and say, we need to structurally address the way in which these communities have been left behind, you're race baiter who's playing the race card and making excuses.
One of the things, though, that has always afflicted the American reality and the American vision is this aversion to history. History is not something you read about in a book. History is not even the past. It's the present.
So one community that is suffering because of structural change claims our empathy and our political allegiance. Another community, which has been purposely excluded, is just whining. And that's what Trump stands for.
So, kind of a sobering way to end this presentation, but I wanted to end it here. I wanted to end it with this kind of a message because for the rest of the time we are here, what we're going to be hearing from are lawyers who have worked extremely hard to try and address the evils that we have been talking about this morning. There are things that we can do, and after we take a short break, we're going to start getting to them. Thank you.